Danzo Shimura is one of the strangest figures in the history of Konoha because almost everything about him seems contradictory. He was responsible for decisions that contributed to the deaths of countless shinobi, manipulated children into becoming weapons, ordered covert operations without the knowledge of the Hokage, and played a major role in some of the darkest events surrounding the village. Yet, for most of his life, Danzo was not treated as a criminal by Konoha. He was treated as a valuable asset. That distinction is important because Danzo's story is not simply about one corrupt shinobi who managed to avoid punishment. It is about a village that repeatedly allowed him to operate in the shadows because the things he was willing to do were useful to the people who remained in the light. To understand why Danzo was allowed to get away with so much, it is necessary to understand the world that created him. Danzo grew up during the era before Konoha had become the stable military power it would eventually become. The village itself was founded by Hashirama Senju and Madara Uchiha as an attempt to end the endless warfare between clans. But the ideals behind Konoha did not immediately eliminate the instincts that had shaped generations of shinobi. Children were still trained to fight. Villages still competed for military strength. And every major nation understood that weakness could invite destruction. Danzo belonged to the generation that inherited this uncertainty. He was trained alongside Hiruzen Sarutobi, Homura Mitokado, and Koharu Utatane. And even as a young shinobi, Danzo developed a very different philosophy from Hiruzen. Hiruzen believed that the village could survive by protecting its people and inspiring future generations, while Danzo believed that survival required sacrifice, secrecy, and strength. The difference between them became clear during their time under Tobirama Senju. When Tobirama and a small group of shinobi were pursued by enemy forces, he understood that someone might need to sacrifice themselves so the others could survive. Hiruzen immediately volunteered to take that role, but Danzo hesitated. He wanted to prove himself, but fear prevented him from acting. Hiruzen stepped forward instead. That moment stayed with Danzo. It became one of the defining insecurities of his life, because he believed that Hiruzen had been chosen as the stronger and more courageous man, while he had failed to act. From that point onward, Danzo became obsessed with the idea that he needed to protect Konoha from the shadows, even if doing so required him to make decisions that ordinary shinobi would never accept. Hiruzen eventually became the third Hokage. Danzo did not, and that difference shaped everything that followed. Hiruzen represented the public face of Konoha, while Danzo gradually built himself into something very different. The man who would handle the problems Hiruzen could not openly touch. This arrangement was never officially declared. Hiruzen did not appoint Danzo as some secret ruler of the village. Instead, Danzo created his own influence. He established Root, a covert branch of the Anbu that operated outside the normal structure of the village. Root shinobi were trained to suppress emotion, obey orders without hesitation, and sacrifice themselves for the mission. Their existence reflected Danzo's worldview perfectly, because he believed that attachment made shinobi weak, and that individual happiness was less important than the survival of the village. Root gave Danzo something extremely valuable: plausible deniability. When Root carried out an operation, the ordinary citizens of Konoha did not necessarily know about it. When an enemy disappeared, when information was acquired through questionable methods, or when an assassination was required, Danzo could operate without the same public accountability expected of the Hokage. This became the foundation of his power. Danzo was useful precisely because he was willing to do things that Hiruzen did not want associated with Konoha. That relationship created a dangerous gray area. Hiruzen generally believed that Konoha should have moral standards, but he also understood that the shinobi world was not always clean. There were threats that could not be solved through diplomacy, public negotiations, or idealistic speeches. Danzo filled that gap. The problem was that Danzo did not simply perform the tasks Hiruzen refused to do. He developed his own agenda. Root became increasingly independent, and Danzo began collecting information, manipulating shinobi, and influencing political decisions without openly challenging the Hokage. He believed that his actions were justified because he viewed himself as one of the few people willing to make the difficult decisions necessary to keep Konoha strong. This mentality would eventually become the excuse for almost everything he did. Danzo could justify manipulation because it protected the village. He could justify assassinations because they eliminated threats. He could justify sacrificing children because they were being trained to protect everyone else. He could justify political manipulation because ordinary citizens did not understand what was necessary to keep them safe. Once a person believes that they alone understand what must be done, almost any action can become defensible. Danzo's greatest advantage was that he rarely needed the entire village to agree with him. He only needed a small number of powerful people to tolerate him. Hiruzen's relationship with Danzo became particularly important because Hiruzen repeatedly allowed him to remain involved in Konoha's affairs. Their relationship was complicated by their history, their shared generation, and their fundamentally different approaches to leadership. Hiruzen did not approve of everything Danzo did, but he also never completely removed him. That distinction would have enormous consequences. Danzo could operate because Konoha's leadership knew that he existed and, at least to some extent, accepted that someone like him had a role to play. His methods could be condemned privately while still being tolerated politically. This is why asking whether Danzo was allowed to get away with everything is more complicated than simply asking why nobody stopped him. People did try to stop him, but they rarely went far enough. And every time Danzo crossed another boundary without suffering serious consequences, he received another confirmation that his philosophy worked. The village needed someone willing to enter the darkness. Danzo believed he was that person. Eventually, this belief would place him at the center of some of Konoha's most controversial decisions, including the suppression of the Uchiha, the manipulation of root operatives, and the political maneuvering surrounding the Hokage. But those later actions did not come from nowhere. They were the product of decades in which Danzo learned that the system would tolerate extraordinary behavior from someone who could convince its leaders that he was protecting the village. And that is the first key to understanding Danzo. He was never truly an outsider. He was created by Konoha's own system, protected by its secrecy, and empowered by the same fear that had shaped the shinobi world since before the village was founded. Danzo did not survive because Konoha believed he was innocent. He survived because too many people believed that someone like him was necessary. If Danzo's influence was built on one idea, it was that Konoha needed people willing to do what ordinary shinobi could not. The official village structure had rules, political oversight, and a public image to protect. But Danzo believed that those restrictions made Konoha vulnerable. His answer was Root, a secret organization designed to operate beneath the visible structure of the village and carry out missions that could never be openly associated with the Hokage. Root was not simply another branch of the Anbu. It was Danzo's personal instrument. Its members were trained from childhood to suppress emotion and treat obedience as more important than individuality. Danzo believed that attachments could compromise a shinobi's judgment, so Root members were encouraged to abandon personal relationships and devote themselves completely to the organization. Their identities were stripped down until they became tools capable of carrying out orders without hesitation. The philosophy was brutal, but it also explains why Konoha tolerated Root for so long. Root produced results. In the dangerous political environment surrounding the major hidden villages, information could be as valuable as military strength. A single enemy spy could potentially expose Konoha's secrets, while one successful assassination could prevent an entire conflict. Danzo understood this better than almost anyone, and Root gave him a force capable of acting before the official government even knew there was a problem. This created a system where Danzo could claim that his actions were necessary, even when they violated the principles Konoha publicly claimed to uphold. Root operated in secrecy, and secrecy made accountability difficult. If a Root operative disappeared, few people outside the organization knew enough to ask questions. If a mission ended in bloodshed, Danzo could argue that the details could not be revealed because doing so would compromise village security. If someone challenged his decisions, he could point to threats that ordinary citizens were never allowed to see. The less people knew, the easier it became to justify the decisions being made. This was one of Danzo's greatest strengths. He understood that information was power, and he deliberately controlled who had access to it. His influence over Root also allowed him to recruit shinobi who possessed valuable abilities or difficult backgrounds. One of the most important examples was Sai, who was trained from childhood to function as an emotionless operative. Sai's upbringing demonstrated the psychological consequences of Danzo's philosophy because he was taught that personal bonds were weaknesses and that the mission mattered more than the individual. The tragedy was that Sai was not naturally incapable of emotion. He had been conditioned to suppress it. Danzo's system, therefore, did not simply recruit people who already shared his worldview. it attempted to create them. That distinction mattered because it showed how far his influence extended. Danzo was not merely giving orders to adults who had voluntarily accepted dangerous missions. He was shaping children into weapons and convincing them that the loss of their individuality was a form of service. Root members were taught that their names, relationships, and personal desires were secondary to Konoha's survival. In Danzo's mind, this was strength. To everyone outside Root, it looked like cruelty. Yet because Root remained hidden, most of Konoha never had to confront that contradiction. This secrecy also protected Danzo politically. Hiruzen could maintain the image of Konoha as a village that valued its people, while Danzo maintained a parallel organization that operated according to completely different rules. The two systems existed simultaneously, creating a strange balance in which Hiruzen represented the ideals of the village, while Danzo represented the actions that those ideals sometimes failed to accommodate. That relationship became increasingly dangerous because Danzo gradually stopped viewing Root as merely a defensive tool. He began using it to influence the political direction of Konoha itself. Rather than simply responding to threats, Danzo sometimes attempted to eliminate problems before they became threats. This meant gathering information on political opponents, manipulating events from behind the scenes, and interfering with individuals whose actions might eventually threaten the village. The justification was always the same. Preventing a problem was better than dealing with the consequences later. This philosophy can sound reasonable until the person making the decisions becomes convinced that almost anyone could eventually become a threat. Danzo's definition of danger gradually expanded. Political disagreement could become disloyalty. Independent thinking could become weakness. A powerful clan could become a potential rebellion. A powerful shinobi could become a future enemy. Once everything was viewed through the lens of potential danger, extreme measures became easier to justify. This was particularly evident in Danzo's relationship with the Uchiha. The Uchiha had always occupied a complicated position within Konoha. They were one of the village's founding clans, yet the Sharingan made them extraordinarily powerful, and their history with the village was marked by mistrust. After the Nine Tails attack, suspicion toward the clan increased dramatically, and Danzo saw the situation not as a tragedy requiring reconciliation, but as a security problem requiring control. For him, the question was not whether the Uchiha were innocent. The question was whether they could become dangerous. That difference would eventually influence the decisions that led toward the Uchiha massacre. But Danzo's ability to influence such enormous events raises an important question. Why did Hiruzen allow him to remain so powerful? Part of the answer lies in the relationship between their philosophies. Hiruzen understood that Danzo was dangerous, but he also understood that Konoha existed in a world where dangerous people were sometimes useful. Completely dismantling Root could potentially eliminate one of the village's most effective intelligence and covert operation networks. Hiruzen therefore attempted to restrain Danzo rather than destroy his organization entirely. That compromise repeatedly failed. Danzo interpreted restraint as permission. Whenever Hiruzen disagreed with him, Danzo could simply wait, operate indirectly, or find another way to accomplish his objective. He rarely needed to openly challenge the Hokage because his influence existed in the spaces where official authority was weakest. This was how he survived. Danzo did not need to control Konoha. He only needed to control enough of the hidden machinery beneath it. Root became that machinery. Through it, Danzo gathered information, trained operatives, conducted covert missions, and cultivated relationships with people who could advance his interests. The organization became so deeply embedded in the village's secret operations that eliminating Danzo would not necessarily eliminate the system he had created. This was another reason he was difficult to remove. He had made himself useful, and usefulness can protect a person from consequences for a surprisingly long time. As long as Konoha faced enemies, Danzo could argue that Root was necessary. As long as Root produced results, its methods could be overlooked. As long as its operations remained secret, ordinary citizens could never fully understand what was being done in their name. Danzo's greatest weapon was therefore not the Sharingan, political authority, or even Root itself. It was the argument that without him, Konoha would be less safe. That argument would follow him through almost every major decision of his career. And eventually, it would be used to justify one of the darkest actions in the history of the village. The conflict between Danzo and the Uchiha was not created overnight. And understanding why Danzo became so determined to eliminate the clan requires looking beyond the massacre itself. For decades, the Uchiha occupied an uncomfortable position within Konoha because they were simultaneously one of the village's founding families and one of the groups most heavily affected by the village's growing suspicion. Danzo did not create that distrust by himself, but he helped transform it from a political problem into a justification for increasingly extreme action. The Nine-Tails attack was the turning point. When the Nine-Tails attacked Konoha, the village suffered enormous casualties, and the fact that the beast's Sharingan-controlled behavior suggested Uchiha involvement caused suspicion to fall upon the clan. There was no proof that the entire Uchiha clan had orchestrated the attack, but fear rarely waits for certainty. Konoha's leadership began viewing the clan with greater suspicion, and the Uchiha were eventually relocated to an isolated section of the village. That decision deepened the problem. The Uchiha interpreted their treatment as discrimination, while Konoha's leadership interpreted the clan's growing resentment as evidence that the Uchiha might eventually rebel. Each side became increasingly convinced that the other was preparing for conflict, creating a cycle in which mistrust produced the very behavior that seemed to justify more mistrust. Danzo saw the situation differently. He did not believe reconciliation was reliable. To him, the possibility of an Uchiha coup represented an unacceptable security risk. The Sharingan made the clan uniquely dangerous, and Danzo feared what could happen if the Uchiha ever gained control of Konoha's leadership or used their abilities against the village. His solution was not negotiation. It was elimination. However, Hiruzen did not initially agree. The third Hokage attempted to find a peaceful solution to the conflict, believing that the Uchiha could still remain part of Konoha if their grievances were addressed. Shisui Uchiha became one of the most important figures in this attempt, because his powerful Sharingan ability, Kotoa Matsukami, offered a potential way to influence the leaders of the clan without bloodshed. Shisui intended to use his ability to prevent the coup. Danzo saw another opportunity. Rather than allowing Shisui to carry out his plan, Danzo attacked him and stole one of his Mangekyō Sharingan. He believed that possessing the eye himself would give him a powerful tool for manipulating political events, and he justified the theft by convincing himself that the village could not afford to leave such an ability in someone else's hands. Shisui was eventually driven to suicide after losing his other eye and realizing that his plan had failed. This was one of the clearest examples of Danzo's willingness to sabotage a peaceful solution if he believed a more extreme option gave him greater control. Yet even after Shisui's death, the situation did not immediately become a massacre. Hiruzen continued attempting to negotiate. The Uchiha coup was approaching, however, and the village leadership faced an increasingly difficult choice. If the clan rebelled, Konoha could potentially descend into civil war at the same moment that it remained vulnerable to outside enemies. Danzo used that fear to strengthen his position. He argued that waiting would only make the eventual conflict more destructive. Eventually, Itachi Uchiha was placed in the impossible position of choosing between his clan and his village. Itachi was deeply opposed to the idea of war, and he sought a way to prevent the coup without destroying his family. Danzo understood that Itachi's loyalty to Konoha could be exploited, and he pressured him into accepting the role of the person who would carry out the massacre if the clan refused to abandon its plans. The result was one of the most horrifying compromises in Konoha's history. The Uchiha clan was destroyed. Almost every member was killed, while Sasuke was deliberately spared. Danzo played a major role in creating the circumstances that made the massacre possible, yet he was not publicly punished for it. This is one of the most important pieces of evidence when examining why Danzo was allowed to get away with so much. The massacre itself was classified as a matter of village security. The truth was hidden from the public. The surviving Uchiha, Sasuke, was given a carefully controlled version of what had happened. And because the full story remained secret, there was never a public trial in which Danzo had to explain his actions. Hiruzen was aware of what had happened. He knew that Danzo had pressured Itachi and interfered with Shisui, yet Danzo remained alive and politically influential. That decision tells us something uncomfortable about Konoha. The village's leadership did not necessarily believe Danzo was innocent. They believed the consequences of exposing the truth might be worse. If the public learned that Konoha's leadership had allowed the destruction of one of its founding clans, the village could lose trust in its government. If other nations learned about the internal conflict, they might exploit Konoha's weakness. If Sasuke learned the complete truth too early, his hatred could turn against the village itself. Secrecy, therefore, became the solution. Danzo benefited enormously from that secrecy. He could continue operating while the people who might have demanded accountability were denied the information necessary to do so. This was not the only reason he survived, but it was one of the clearest examples of the system protecting itself rather than seeking justice. Danzo could argue that his actions had prevented a civil war. And from a purely strategic perspective, he had a point. The Uchiha coup did not happen. Konoha did not descend into a prolonged internal conflict. The village remained intact. But the method created consequences that would eventually return with devastating force. Sasuke survived. Itachi was forced to live as a criminal and murderer in the eyes of the world. The truth about the massacre remained hidden, and the surviving hatred surrounding the Uchiha did not disappear. It simply moved into another generation. Danzo therefore achieved what he wanted in the short term while creating enormous, long-term consequences. This was characteristic of his entire philosophy. He prioritized immediate security over future stability. If a problem could be eliminated today, he was willing to accept the possibility that another problem would appear tomorrow. The Uchiha massacre also demonstrated why Danzo was so difficult to remove from power. He rarely acted completely alone. There were always other officials, operatives, or circumstances surrounding his decisions, meaning that responsibility could be distributed across the system. He could point to the threat of the coup. Hiruzen could point to the need to preserve peace. Itachi could point to the protection of the village. The elders could point to national security. And the truth could remain buried beneath all of them. Danzo's genius was not that he could force everyone to agree with him. It was that he could create circumstances where other people eventually made choices that benefited him. The Uchiha massacre was therefore more the destruction of the Uchiha clan should have been the moment when Danzo's influence finally became impossible to tolerate, because by this point he had gone far beyond simply advising the Hokage or maintaining a covert military organization. He had interfered with Shisui Uchiha, stolen one of Shisui's eyes, contributed to the collapse of a peaceful solution, pressured Itachi into carrying out the massacre, and then continued operating as though none of it had happened. Yet the remarkable thing was that Danzo did not become a fugitive after the massacre, nor was he publicly exposed as the architect of the decisions that had led to it. Instead, he remained within Konoha's political structure, protected by the same secrecy that had allowed the massacre to occur in the first place. This reveals an important pattern in Danzo's story. Whenever his actions became too dangerous to defend openly, the village did not necessarily punish him. It simply buried the truth. That secrecy was especially powerful because Danzo understood that political authority depended heavily on controlling information. The average citizen of Konoha did not know what Root was doing, did not know how often Danzo interfered with village affairs, and certainly did not know the full circumstances surrounding the Uchiha massacre. Even many shinobi who worked within the village's official military structure had little understanding of how deeply Danzo operated beneath the surface. When information was restricted to a small group of leaders, there was no broad public pressure demanding accountability. And when an operation was classified as a matter of national security, questioning its morality could itself be portrayed as dangerous. Danzo therefore benefited from a system in which secrecy was not merely a way of hiding his actions, but a mechanism that prevented anyone from building enough evidence to challenge him effectively. Hiruzen's personality also played a major role in allowing this system to continue. The third Hokage was not blind to Danzo's behavior, and their disagreements were well established. But Hiruzen repeatedly chose restraint over confrontation. Part of this came from their history together, because Danzo was not an enemy who had suddenly appeared inside Konoha. He was someone Hiruzen had known since childhood, someone who had fought alongside him, and someone who genuinely believed that he was protecting the village even when his methods became increasingly extreme. Hiruzen could therefore look at Danzo and see both a threat and a former comrade who represented a philosophy that, in his own way, was trying to accomplish the same ultimate objective. The difference was that Hiruzen believed the village needed compassion and trust to survive, while Danzo believed survival required fear, secrecy, and sacrifice. Hiruzen repeatedly attempted to keep Danzo under control without completely eliminating the structures that gave him power. And that compromise allowed Danzo to continue operating in the space between official authority and unofficial necessity. The existence of Root made this compromise even more complicated because Konoha genuinely benefited from having highly trained operatives capable of carrying out missions that could not safely be assigned to ordinary shinobi. The village existed in a world where assassination, espionage, sabotage, and intelligence gathering were normal parts of international politics. And Hiruzen could not simply pretend that these realities did not exist. Danzo exploited that reality by making himself indispensable. If Hiruzen attempted to dismantle Root completely, he would be removing an organization that possessed valuable intelligence networks and highly trained operatives, while potentially forcing those people into a less controllable environment. Danzo could therefore present himself as a necessary evil, arguing that someone had to perform the actions that the Hokage could not publicly authorize. The more dangerous the world became, the stronger that argument appeared. And every new crisis gave Danzo another opportunity to explain why his existence was necessary. This became particularly important during the period following the Uchiha massacre, when Konoha faced an entirely different threat from the organization known as the Akatsuki. Danzo understood that the village's greatest military assets were its Jinchuriki and powerful bloodline users, and he believed that these individuals should be treated primarily as strategic resources. Naruto Uzumaki represented perhaps the greatest example of this philosophy, because he contained the Nine Tails. Yet Hiruzen had deliberately tried to ensure that Naruto would be accepted as a person rather than simply treated as a weapon. Danzo's worldview was almost the exact opposite. To him, powerful individuals existed primarily in relation to the security of the village, and their personal feelings were secondary whenever the survival of Konoha was at stake. This philosophy extended to the way Danzo treated the children under his command. Root operatives were not encouraged to develop ordinary relationships. because Danzo believed emotional attachment could compromise their ability to complete missions. Sai became one of the clearest examples of this conditioning, as he was raised in an environment where emotions were treated as liabilities and personal bonds were discouraged. Danzo effectively attempted to remove the individual from the shinobi, creating people who could perform acts of violence without hesitation because they had been taught that their own identity was less important than their function. From Danzo's perspective, this was an efficient way to create perfect soldiers. But from another perspective, it was the systematic destruction of the very humanity that Konoha claimed to protect. The tragedy is that Danzo genuinely believed these sacrifices were meaningful. He was not simply motivated by money, pleasure, or personal cruelty in the conventional sense. He believed that someone had to carry the burden of making terrible decisions, and he increasingly convinced himself that he was uniquely qualified to make them. That belief allowed him to reinterpret every failure as evidence that he needed even more control. If a negotiation failed, he believed the village needed stronger intelligence. If an enemy survived, he believed the village needed more ruthless operatives. If a political faction resisted him, he believed the faction was exposing itself as a potential threat. Each problem became another argument for expanding the power of the hidden system he had created. This is also why Danzo's ambition to become Hokage was so important. For years, he had operated behind the official leader while privately believing that his philosophy was superior to Hiruzen's. He saw Hiruzen's compassion as weakness and believed that the village had survived despite Hiruzen's idealism, rather than because of it. Yet Danzo's desire to become Hokage was not simply about prestige. He wanted official authority because he believed that his methods would be more effective if he no longer had to operate indirectly. As long as Hiruzen remained Hokage, Danzo had to work around someone who could restrain him. If Danzo became Hokage, the distinction between the hidden hand and the official government would disappear. That opportunity finally appeared after Pain attacked Konoha. When Pain destroyed much of the village and Hiruzen was already dead, Danzo moved quickly to position himself as the leader Konoha needed. He manipulated the political situation surrounding Tsunade, who was incapacitated after the attack, and allowed himself to be appointed the 6th Hokage candidate during the crisis. For the first time, the man who had spent decades operating from the shadows was close to possessing the official authority he had always believed he deserved. But there was an irony in Danzo finally reaching this position. The moment he stepped out of the shadows, his methods became much easier to see. As a secretive advisor, he could hide behind the argument that his actions were necessary for national security. As Hokage, he was expected to represent the village openly, make decisions publicly, and accept responsibility for what happened under his authority. The political protection provided by secrecy was beginning to disappear, and Danzo was about to discover that controlling Konoha from the shadows was very different from convincing the entire shinobi world that he deserved to lead it. His first major test would come at the 5-Kage Summit, where Danzo's decisions would place him directly in the middle of an international crisis. and expose just how far he was willing to go when he finally had the authority he had spent his life seeking. For most of his life, Danzo had operated in a world where secrecy protected him from the consequences of his decisions. He could manipulate events, send root operatives into dangerous situations, and influence Konoha's leadership while remaining largely invisible to the people affected by his actions. But after Pain's destruction of Konoha left Tsunade incapacitated, Danzo finally received something he had wanted for decades: the opportunity to become Hokage. The irony was that the position he had spent his life believing he deserved would ultimately expose the weaknesses that secrecy had concealed. Danzo was appointed acting 6th Hokage during one of the most unstable periods in Konoha's history, but his position was immediately controversial. He had not earned the title through the traditional process of becoming the village's unquestioned leader, and many of his actions had been hidden from the public. Yet Danzo saw the crisis as proof that his philosophy had been correct. Konoha had been attacked, the village had been nearly destroyed, and its previous leader was unable to govern. To Danzo, this was exactly the kind of situation in which a leader without hesitation was required. He believed that the village could no longer afford the uncertainty and compassion that had characterized Hiruzen and Tsunade, and he intended to use his new authority to impose a much harder form of security. His first major challenge came almost immediately when the 5 Kage Summit was called to discuss the threat posed by the Akatsuki. The organization had become an international crisis, and the kidnapping of Jinchuriki had made the situation even more dangerous. The major villages were beginning to realize that the Akatsuki was not simply a collection of missing nine, but a force capable of destabilizing the entire shinobi world. Danzo therefore entered the summit with an opportunity that few people in Konoha had ever possessed. He could present himself not as the secretive figure behind Root, but as the official representative of one of the world's greatest military powers. Yet Danzo's behavior at the summit demonstrated that his philosophy had not changed simply because his title had. He continued to manipulate. Rather than openly discussing every action he intended to take, Danzo relied on deception and his own covert resources to influence events. One of his most important tools was Shisui's stolen Sharingan, which he had implanted into his right eye and hidden beneath bandages for years. The eye's Kotoa Matsukami ability could manipulate another person's thoughts without the target necessarily realizing that they had been influenced. Danzo viewed this ability as the ultimate political weapon because it allowed him to alter decisions without openly forcing anyone to obey him. At the summit, he attempted to use the technique against Mifune, the leader of the Land of Iron's samurai forces, hoping to influence the political discussion and gain greater control over the coalition forming against the Akatsuki. The attempt reflected Danzo's entire approach to leadership. He did not trust negotiation to produce the outcome he wanted, so he attempted to control the person making the decision instead. To Danzo, this was not necessarily unethical manipulation. He believed that if influencing one person's mind could protect thousands of lives, then refusing to use the technique would itself be irresponsible. This was the logic that had protected him for decades. The end justified the method. But the summit also exposed another side of Danzo's character, his obsession with eliminating threats before they became impossible to control. Sasuke Uchiha had become one of those threats. After leaving Orochimaru and eventually joining the conflict surrounding the Akatsuki, Sasuke became increasingly hostile toward Konoha after learning the truth about the Uchiha massacre. Once he discovered Danzo's role in the events surrounding his clan, Sasuke's anger became focused directly on him. Danzo understood that Sasuke represented more than a personal enemy. He represented evidence. If Sasuke learned the entire truth and revealed it to the world, the carefully constructed secrecy surrounding the Uchiha massacre could collapse. The surviving Uchiha was therefore a political threat as much as a combat threat. Danzo's instinct was exactly what it had always been: eliminate the problem before it could become larger. This led to his confrontation with Sasuke. The battle revealed how dangerous Danzo had become after decades of experimentation, political maneuvering, and possession of stolen Sharingan. Beneath his clothing and bandages, Danzo had implanted multiple Sharingan into his arm, and he had also incorporated Hashirama's cells into his body. These modifications gave him access to extraordinary abilities and allowed him to use Izanagi, a forbidden Uchiha technique that could temporarily alter the relationship between reality and illusion. Danzo had effectively turned his own body into a collection of stolen powers. The irony was impossible to miss. The man who had spent years claiming that the Uchiha represented a dangerous threat to Konoha had secretly taken their most valuable abilities and incorporated them into himself. The man who believed that bloodlines had to be controlled had built his own strength from the biological characteristics of the very clan he feared. His battle with Sasuke therefore represented more than a physical confrontation. It was the collision between Danzo's past and its consequences. Every decision he had made to eliminate the Uchiha threat had helped create Sasuke. Every secret he had helped bury had contributed to Sasuke's hatred. Every attempt to control the situation had ultimately pushed the surviving Uchiha further away from Konoha. And now Danzo was forced to fight the person created by those decisions. Despite his extensive modifications, Danzo was eventually defeated. But even in defeat, he refused to admit that his philosophy had been wrong. He attempted to destroy Shisui's remaining eye rather than allow it to fall into someone else's hands. And when it became clear that he could not escape, he activated a sealing technique in an attempt to take his enemies down with him. His final actions demonstrated how deeply his ideology had consumed him. Danzo could not imagine surrendering. He could not imagine admitting that his choices had been mistakes. And he could not accept the possibility that the tools he had spent his life collecting might fall under someone else's control. In the end, he died trying to preserve the secrets he had spent decades protecting. Yet Danzo's death raises the question that sits at the center of this entire story. Why did it take so long? Why was a man who had committed so many questionable acts allowed to remain influential for decades? only finally losing everything when he attempted to claim the position of Hokage. The answer is that Danzo's power had always depended on distance. When he was hidden, his actions could be rationalized as necessary. When he was exposed, those same actions became much harder to defend. As acting Hokage, Danzo could no longer hide completely behind Root. His decisions affected international politics directly, and his attempt to manipulate the Five Kage Summit demonstrated that the methods that had once operated beneath Konoha were now being used at the highest level of international leadership. The Five Kage saw him not as Konoha's secret weapon, but as a potential threat. And once that happened, Danzo's greatest protection began to disappear. His death did not erase the consequences of his actions. The Uchiha were still dead. Sasuke was still consumed by hatred. Root's former members still carried the psychological scars of their upbringing, and Konoha still had to live with the uncomfortable truth that one of its most influential figures had been able to operate for decades without meaningful accountability. Danzo had finally stepped out of the shadows, and the moment the world could see him clearly, it became much harder to believe that everything he had done was simply for the good of the village. Danzo's greatest strength was his ability to turn cruelty into something that sounded like responsibility. He rarely described his actions as selfish, and he almost never presented himself as someone who enjoyed causing suffering. Instead, he framed everything through the language of duty, sacrifice, and survival, arguing that Konoha could only remain safe if someone was willing to make decisions that ordinary people were too compassionate to make. This allowed him to look at assassination, manipulation, indoctrination, and political interference not as crimes, but as unpleasant necessities. Once someone believes that they alone are willing to make the decisions everyone else is too afraid to make, however, there is almost no natural limit to what they can eventually justify. Danzo's worldview had been shaped by fear long before he became the leader of Root. He had grown up during a period when children were sent into battle. Clans could be destroyed overnight, and hesitation could mean death for everyone around you. His failure to volunteer when Tobirama prepared to sacrifice himself became one of the defining memories of his life. And rather than accepting fear as a normal part of being human, Danzo became obsessed with eliminating weakness from himself and from the people around him. Hiruzen represented the person Danzo believed he should have been. So he gradually built an identity around everything he believed Hiruzen lacked: ruthlessness, suspicion, secrecy, and the willingness to sacrifice others when necessary. In a strange way, much of Danzo's later cruelty came from his inability to accept the frightened young man he had once been. The result was a philosophy that placed Konoha above almost everything else. On the surface, this sounded noble, because protecting the village was supposed to be the responsibility of every shinobi. But Danzo took that principle to its most extreme conclusion. If Konoha was always more important than the individual, then individuals could become expendable. A shinobi could be sacrificed for a mission. A child could be conditioned into a weapon. Political opponents could be manipulated. And even an entire clan could be destroyed if Danzo believed its existence threatened the stability of the village. The village stopped being a community of people in his mind and became something closer to an organism that had to survive, regardless of which parts had to be cut away. This was the fundamental danger behind Root. Its members were taught to suppress emotion, abandon personal attachments, and obey orders without hesitation, because Danzo believed that emotional bonds created weaknesses that enemies could exploit. Sai became one of the clearest examples of this philosophy, growing up in an environment where friendship and individuality were treated as obstacles rather than important parts of life. Danzo could point to the effectiveness of these shinobi as evidence that his system worked, but he ignored what had been taken from them in the process. A person who has been trained not to care may be easier to command, but that does not necessarily make them stronger. It simply makes them easier to use. The same mentality appeared in Danzo's treatment of the Uchiha. He looked at the possibility of a coup and decided that the risk was too great to tolerate. From his perspective, eliminating the clan could prevent a civil war and protect Konoha from internal destruction. But his reasoning removed an important question from the discussion: whether the conflict could have been resolved without destroying the people involved. Once Danzo decided that the Uchiha represented a potential threat, their anger became evidence of rebellion. Their political demands became evidence of disloyalty. And their Sharingan became another reason to fear what they might eventually become capable of. The massacre therefore solved one problem while creating another. The coup never happened, but Sasuke survived. The truth was hidden, but that truth eventually became one of the greatest sources of Sasuke's hatred. Danzo believed he was preventing a future enemy, yet his decisions helped create the very enemy he had feared. This pattern appeared repeatedly throughout his life. Danzo believed secrecy would protect Konoha, but secrecy allowed resentment and corruption to grow beneath the surface. He believed emotional detachment would create stronger shinobi, but it produced people who struggled to understand ordinary human relationships. He believed eliminating threats early would prevent future wars, yet his methods repeatedly created new enemies and deeper conflicts. The difference between Danzo and Hiruzen becomes especially important here. Hiruzen was not a perfect leader, and his willingness to tolerate Danzo was one of his greatest failures. But he fundamentally believed that Konoha was made of people. Danzo believed Konoha was something that existed above them. Hiruzen wanted shinobi to develop bonds because he believed those bonds created loyalty and gave future generations something worth protecting. Danzo wanted shinobi to suppress those bonds because he believed attachment could interfere with duty. Hiruzen believed that people could become stronger through trust, while Danzo believed they became stronger by learning to survive without anyone. The irony is that the world of Naruto repeatedly demonstrates the weakness in Danzo's philosophy. Naruto becomes powerful not because he has removed his emotional attachments, but because of them. His bonds with Iruka, Jiraiya, Kakashi, Sakura, Sasuke, and the wider village give him reasons to continue fighting when strength alone is not enough. Even Sai, after being raised according to Root's philosophy, gradually discovers that friendship does not make him weaker. It gives him an identity beyond the missions he was assigned. Danzo could never fully understand that distinction because he viewed vulnerability and connection as essentially the same thing. For him, caring about someone meant giving an enemy something to exploit. For Naruto, caring about someone meant having something worth defending. This does not mean Danzo's concerns were completely imaginary. The shinobi world really was dangerous. Villages spied on one another. Political leaders ordered assassinations. Powerful bloodlines could change the balance of power. And children were routinely placed in situations where their decisions could affect thousands of lives. Danzo understood these realities more clearly than many idealists did. His mistake was believing that because ruthless decisions were sometimes necessary, ruthlessness should therefore become the foundation of leadership. A village might occasionally have to make a terrible decision. That does not mean every terrible decision is necessary. Danzo gradually lost the ability to tell the difference. Every successful operation became evidence that his methods worked. If Root uncovered an enemy, secrecy had supposedly saved the village. If a threat disappeared, eliminating it had supposedly been the correct choice. If the Uchiha coup never happened, Danzo could point to the massacre as proof that his fears had been justified. But there was no way to measure the alternatives. No one could know exactly what would have happened if the Uchiha had been allowed more time to negotiate, if Shisui's plan had been allowed to proceed, or if Danzo had been prevented from interfering. His philosophy was therefore almost impossible to disprove from inside the system. Success validated his methods, while failure could always be blamed on insufficient ruthlessness. If something went wrong, the answer was not necessarily that Danzo's approach had been flawed. It could simply mean that he had not been given enough authority, enough information, or enough freedom to act. This mindset became especially dangerous because Konoha repeatedly reinforced it. Hiruzen restrained Danzo, but rarely destroyed his influence. The village benefited from Root's intelligence networks and covert operations. Other leaders knew that Danzo was dangerous, but they also knew that removing him completely could create problems of its own. Every time he crossed another boundary without suffering serious consequences, Danzo received another confirmation that his methods were tolerated as long as they remained useful. That is why his eventual attempt to become Hokage was so significant. For decades, Danzo had been able to claim that he was protecting the village from the shadows. He could make decisions without publicly defending them because the details were classified. And he could hide behind the argument that ordinary citizens did not need to know everything required to keep them safe. But once he became acting Hokage, that distance began disappearing. His actions were no longer simply the decisions of a hidden advisor. They were the actions of the village's official leader. Danzo had spent his entire life believing that Konoha needed someone willing to become its darkness. But he failed to recognize that darkness becomes dangerous when the person standing inside it begins to believe he is the only one who can see clearly. That was ultimately the cost of his philosophy. He sacrificed trust in the name of security, individuality in the name of discipline, and morality in the name of survival. And by the time the consequences of those choices could no longer be hidden, Danzo had already spent decades creating them. For most of his life, Danzo insisted that he did not seek power for personal reasons. He presented himself as a man who was willing to remain in the shadows because someone had to perform the unpleasant work required to protect Konoha. Yet beneath that explanation was an ambition that had existed since his childhood. Danzo wanted to become Hokage. His desire was not simply about recognition or wearing the hat. He genuinely believed that Konoha needed a leader who was willing to make decisions without hesitation, someone who could sacrifice individuals when necessary and act before threats became disasters. In Danzo's mind, that person was himself. His rivalry with Hiruzen was at the center of this ambition. Both had trained under Tobirama. Both had experienced the brutality of the early shinobi era. And both understood that the survival of Konoha could depend on decisions made in moments of extreme pressure. Yet when Tobirama eventually chose Hiruzen as his successor, Danzo was left behind. Hiruzen had stepped forward when Danzo hesitated, and that moment became one of the deepest insecurities of Danzo's life. He never completely accepted that Hiruzen had been the better choice. Instead, he spent decades trying to prove that his own philosophy was more suitable for leading the village. This created a rivalry that was more complicated than simple hatred. Danzo did not necessarily believe that Hiruzen was incapable of protecting Konoha. In fact, he respected Hiruzen's abilities. What he rejected was Hiruzen's willingness to trust people and search for peaceful solutions. Whenever Hiruzen showed mercy, Danzo saw weakness. Whenever Hiruzen attempted diplomacy, Danzo saw unnecessary risk. Whenever Hiruzen refused to authorize something extreme, Danzo believed that someone else would eventually have to do what the Hokage was unwilling to do. That someone was usually Danzo himself. Root became the foundation of this philosophy. By creating an organization of shinobi who answered directly to him, Danzo developed a source of influence that existed alongside Konoha's official government. Root gathered intelligence, carried out covert missions, eliminated threats, and trained operatives to obey without hesitation. This gave Danzo something extremely valuable: power, without the same level of public accountability expected from the Hokage. Hiruzen could disagree with Danzo, but completely removing him was difficult because Root had become useful. The village benefited from its intelligence and covert operations, particularly in a world where other villages were constantly gathering information and preparing for war. Danzo could therefore present himself as a necessary evil. If Hiruzen wanted to remain the village's compassionate leader, Danzo could become the man who handled the decisions that compassion supposedly could not allow. This arrangement continued for years. and every crisis strengthened Danzo's argument. The Uchiha crisis was perhaps the greatest example. Hiruzen wanted to prevent the possibility of a coup through negotiation, while Danzo believed the threat was too dangerous to leave unresolved. When Shisui attempted to use his Kotoa Matsukami to peacefully influence the Uchiha leadership, Danzo interfered and stole one of Shisui's eyes. He believed that such a powerful ability could not be left outside his control, and his actions helped destroy one of the final opportunities for a peaceful resolution. When the situation eventually reached the point where Itachi was forced to choose between his clan and Konoha, Danzo supported the decision to eliminate the Uchiha. The massacre removed the possibility of an immediate coup, and from Danzo's perspective, that could be presented as proof that his approach had worked. But Danzo's victory came at a cost that he failed to recognize. Sasuke survived. The truth was hidden, and the hatred created by the massacre would eventually return directly to Danzo. Still, Danzo remained in the shadows while Hiruzen continued to lead Konoha. For years, this allowed Danzo to maintain the belief that he was the leader the village truly needed, even though someone else occupied the position. He could criticize Hiruzen's decisions without being forced to accept the full consequences of his own. Then, pain attacked Konoha. The destruction of the village changed everything. Hiruzen was already dead. Tsunade was incapacitated, and Konoha suddenly needed a leader who could take control during a period of extreme instability. Danzo moved quickly and positioned himself as the strongest candidate to lead the village. After decades of waiting, he finally had an opportunity to obtain the position he believed had been denied to him. For Danzo, becoming acting Hokage was not simply a political development. It was the culmination of his entire life. He could finally stop arguing that his philosophy was better and demonstrate it directly. His leadership immediately reflected the difference between himself and the Hokages who had come before him. Danzo was more aggressive toward potential threats and less interested in compromise. He viewed powerful individuals primarily through the lens of security, which meant that people such as Naruto and Sasuke were not simply young shinobi with complicated lives. They were strategic variables that could either strengthen or threaten Konoha. His position also brought him to the 5 Kage summit, where the major villages were gathering to discuss the growing threat of the Akatsuki. This was Danzo's opportunity to establish himself as a legitimate international leader. For decades, he had believed that his methods were what Konoha needed. Now, he could represent those methods directly to the other great villages. But Danzo made the same mistake he had made throughout his career. He assumed that secrecy and manipulation were acceptable simply because the goal was protecting Konoha. At the summit, he possessed Shisui's stolen Sharingan and attempted to use Kotoa Matsukami to influence Mifune's decision-making. The technique allowed Danzo to manipulate another person's thoughts without openly revealing that he was doing so. From his perspective, this was an efficient political tool. Why risk an uncertain vote when he could simply guarantee the outcome? But to the other Kage, The implications were alarming. The man representing Konoha was secretly attempting to control the political process. Danzo had spent decades benefiting from the fact that people inside Konoha did not know everything he did. The five Kage had no reason to extend that trust to him. They saw his behavior without the decades of history that had allowed Hiruzen and the village elders to tolerate him. And then there was Sasuke. By this point, Sasuke knew the truth about the Uchiha massacre and understood Danzo's role in it. Danzo therefore faced a threat that was deeply personal, but also politically dangerous. Sasuke was living evidence of the consequences of his decisions. And if Sasuke revealed everything, the secrets surrounding the massacre could no longer be controlled. Danzo responded by trying to eliminate him. Their confrontation revealed how far Danzo had gone in pursuit of power. The Sharingan implanted into his arm, the use of Hashirama's cells, and his repeated use of Izanagi showed that he had turned himself into a collection of stolen abilities. The man who claimed that the Uchiha were too dangerous to be trusted had spent years taking their powers and making them part of his own body. There was a deeper irony behind this. Danzo had always claimed that he wanted power only because Konoha needed protection. Yet the more power he acquired, the more his actions became centered around controlling events himself. He wanted to decide which threats mattered, which people could be sacrificed, and which truths could remain hidden. His desire to protect Konoha had become inseparable from his desire to control it. And when Danzo finally stepped into the position he had spent his life pursuing, the protection of secrecy began disappearing. For decades, he had been able to hide behind the shadows. Now, for the first time, everyone could see the man standing inside them. Danzo's death did not come because Konoha suddenly discovered that he had been doing terrible things. The people closest to him already knew that he was dangerous, and Hiruzen had spent years attempting to keep his influence under control. What changed was that Danzo eventually reached a point where the protection provided by secrecy was no longer enough. For decades, he had survived because his actions could be separated from the official face of Konoha. He operated through root, relied on classified information, and allowed other leaders to maintain the appearance that the village was governed according to ordinary principles. Once Danzo became acting Hokage, that separation began to disappear, and the weaknesses in his entire system became impossible to hide. His confrontation with Sasuke was the clearest example. Sasuke was not simply another enemy standing in Danzo's way. He was the surviving member of the Uchiha clan who had learned the truth about the massacre, including Danzo's involvement. To Danzo, Sasuke represented everything that could go wrong when a secret was allowed to survive. The massacre had been intended to eliminate the possibility of an Uchiha uprising. But one surviving Uchiha now carried the truth of what had happened and had become powerful enough to challenge the village itself. Danzo therefore treated Sasuke as a threat that needed to be eliminated immediately. The battle revealed the full extent of Danzo's preparation. The Sharingan implanted into his arm, the Hashirama cells incorporated into his body, and his use of Izanagi allowed him to survive attacks that should have killed him. Each time Sasuke believed he had defeated him, Danzo could effectively rewrite the outcome and continue fighting. It was an appropriate representation of the way Danzo had operated politically for decades. Every time someone thought they had reached the end of his influence, he found another hidden resource that allowed him to continue. But the battle also exposed something Danzo had spent his entire life trying to hide. He was afraid of losing control. Danzo had built his identity around the belief that he was willing to sacrifice anything for Konoha. Yet when his own life was finally at risk, he fought desperately to preserve himself and the tools he had accumulated. Even when defeat became unavoidable, his instinct was not to surrender or accept responsibility. He attempted to destroy Shisui's remaining eye and ultimately prepared a sealing technique that could potentially take his enemies down with him. His final actions were completely consistent with the man he had always been. Danzo would rather destroy what he could not control than allow someone else to possess it. This is particularly important when considering why he was allowed to get away with so much for so long. Danzo's power did not come only from his own abilities. It came from the structure surrounding him. Konoha was a military village operating in a world where espionage, assassination, and political manipulation were ordinary parts of international conflict. There was always a reason to tolerate someone who was willing to perform the work that respectable leaders did not want associated with their names. Danzo understood this perfectly. He made himself useful. That usefulness became his shield. Whenever his methods became too extreme, the village could tell itself that Root served a necessary purpose. Whenever he crossed a political boundary, his actions could be classified as matters of national security. Whenever someone questioned his motives, Danzo could argue that the people criticizing him did not understand the threats he had seen from behind the scenes. And sometimes he was right. The threats were real. The Akatsuki was real. Foreign villages were dangerous. The Uchiha coup was a genuine possibility. Powerful individuals could destroy entire countries. The shinobi world was built around violence, and someone in Konoha inevitably had to deal with its darker side. That is what makes Danzo more complicated than a simple villain. His worldview was born from genuine fears. His mistake was turning those fears into a permanent justification for control. Danzo eventually stopped asking whether a particular sacrifice was necessary, and began assuming that sacrifice was necessary because he had decided it was. He stopped treating secrecy as a temporary tool and began treating it as the foundation of leadership. He stopped viewing Root as an organization that served Konoha and gradually began treating Konoha as something that needed to be managed through Root. The difference was subtle at first, but over decades, it became enormous. This is also why Hiruzen's failure to completely remove Danzo matters so much. Hiruzen knew Danzo was dangerous, but he repeatedly chose to restrain him rather than destroy the system that gave him influence. Their history made that decision easier to understand. They had fought together, survived wars together, and grown up in the same generation. Hiruzen knew that Danzo genuinely believed he was protecting the village. But understanding someone does not mean allowing them unlimited power. Hiruzen's reluctance gave Danzo decades of additional influence. Every time Danzo survived another confrontation with the Hokage, he became more confident. Every time Root continued operating, the organization became more established. Every time Konoha benefited from one of its covert missions, it became harder to argue that Root should disappear completely. Danzo's greatest protection was therefore not fear. It was usefulness. That is why his eventual death was so significant. By the time he fought Sasuke, Danzo had lost much of the political protection that had allowed him to operate for so long. Hiruzen was dead. Tsunade was incapacitated. The 5 Kage had already witnessed his manipulation at the summit. Sasuke was actively hunting him. Naruto's generation was increasingly challenging the assumptions that had defined the older shinobi system. The world around Danzo was changing, and Danzo was not. He still believed that the answer to instability was greater control. He still believed that information was more dangerous than ignorance. He still believed that people were safest when they were willing to sacrifice themselves without hesitation. The younger generation increasingly believed the opposite. Naruto's strength came from his bonds with other people. Kakashi had learned to value his comrades rather than simply completing missions. Even the survivors of Konoha's darker history were beginning to question whether endless cycles of revenge and secrecy actually protected anyone. Danzo belonged to an older philosophy of the shinobi world, a philosophy built around the belief that peace could only exist if someone was willing to become the darkness that protected everyone else. But the tragedy of that philosophy was that the person who becomes the darkness can eventually forget what they were protecting. Danzo claimed to protect Konoha, yet his methods repeatedly damaged the people who made Konoha worth protecting. He destroyed trust in the name of security, sacrificed individuals in the name of the village, and manipulated others because he believed that only he could understand what was necessary. His greatest failure was therefore not any single decision. It was the belief that he could never be wrong. That belief explains why Danzo was allowed to get away with so much. The village did not always excuse him because it approved of his actions. Sometimes it tolerated him because it was afraid of what might happen without him. His existence became tied to the uncomfortable reality of the shinobi system itself. Everyone wanted peace, but someone still had to deal with the violence required to maintain it. Danzo simply volunteered to become that person. And eventually, he went too far. When he died, the secrets he had protected did not disappear with him. The Uchiha massacre had already shaped Sasuke's life. Root had already shaped its former members. His political decisions had already affected Konoha and the wider shinobi world. Killing Danzo could not undo any of those consequences. But it did mark the end of a certain kind of power. For decades, Danzo had survived because he existed between the shadows and the light, close enough to influence the village, but distant enough to avoid full responsibility. Once he stepped into the light, that protection vanished. The man who had spent his life believing that he was the only one willing to do what was necessary, finally discovered the price of making himself indispensable. Konoha could survive without him. And perhaps that was the truth Danzo had been unable to accept all along.